Head, shoulders, knees, and toes. Looks like he's got them all. 4 out of 4. Eyes, ears, mouth, and nose. Well, he's got 1 out of 4 at least. Hi, I'm Paintman Journeying, and in this video I'm going to be painting this thing. It's called the Grabbler, and I'll give you 8 guesses why it's called that. So that anyone can follow along with this video, we've made the Grabbler available in a few places. First, by joining the Trapper tier for $12 on either our Patreon or My Mini Factory Tribe. Or you can get the STL for free by signing up for the newsletter, to which there's a link in the description. While there, you can also check out the Soldier tier. This month's theme, the Dark Woods. It's a bit of a conundrum for me, since generally I don't like to paint skin, and well, this thing is nothing but skin. So I'll be slipping out of my comfort zone for this, but on the bright side, there's no eyes to paint. I'll start with the biggest section, of course, and that will be his entire body. But seeing as how I think it can deal with being a bit pale at the end, I don't want to start on just black, so I'm going to add some color with my airbrush. The first one being a purple with just a little bit of yellow to brighten it up a bit. I'll apply it in a few thin coats, mostly around its main circular body and a little outside that into the arms and shoulders. The reason I didn't get its hands is because with so much of this model going to be one material, I think it might be too much if it's the same color overall. So I'm going to do a bit of color shifting as I paint towards the hands. So for them, they get a base coat too, but this time it's with a blue with a bit of white to lighten. You can always just start with a lighter blue if you have one. And lastly, I want some big vibrant red lips for him in the end. But the best way to get a vibrant red is to start over a much brighter color. So to overcome the black, I'm just going to use a magenta mixed with a white for a light neon pink. I could mask out his lips to make sure there's no overspray if I were to do this later instead in the process, but seeing as how there's many more layers to go, I'm not too worried about that overspray at the moment, just getting a solid color to work from later. I need to map out a plan on my palette now, to go from my purple and blue underlayers to a golden pale skin. First, I have to mix up the skin color, since I only use single pigment paints, but if you have a pre-blended golden skin, certainly use it. To do that, I need some yellow, a bit of an orange brown, and white. Golden skin is basically a very pale light orange, so using mostly the orange and white, I can start pretty close and just use the yellow to shift it a bit if I feel like I'm losing some of the vibrancy. Now that I have my skin tone, I can make some mid-mixes between it and my base color. I want my mid color to be an orange, so I'll get more of the orange I used and just mix in less white, but still add some yellow for the vibrancy. Then take that and some purple for a mid-mix between those. On the other end, I can just mix in more of the pale mix each step of the way. I'm going to use my airbrush for a lot of this, just to keep transitions smooth. So I'll start with a matte medium and some thinner and mix in my first highlight. But only a bit of it at first, so my first layer is quite transparent over the dark underlayers. So I don't have to be too careful with aiming, just get them all over with a window frosting, as it were. Once I've got that layer on, I can add a bit more of the mix and start to get in close with the airbrush to start filling in more of the contours and light catching parts. There's still 3 more layers to go though, so I'm just going to focus on general areas instead of individual things like knuckles. Once that layer has a good buildup, we should see the skin tones start to make sense, where his shadows keep a bit of the colors, but overall will have a more fleshy look. Using the airbrush still with my middle mix of mostly the orange and yellow with a bit of white, I'll start to define some of the muscles, get in right close with my airbrush and aiming for the bulbs and bulges of all the musculature. This should give me a rough outline and direction for all my highlights. Now to refine. I'll take my brush with the same mix and start to pick out areas for textures and color reinforcement. Not all the highlights are going to be softened bubbles, so I can use this to extend edges along more square muscles and into some lighter depths. I'll also pick out the veins that are sculpted into the model so that they're well defined, but do so by adding a bit of red or blue to my brush tip first, starting in the middle of the vein and pulling it away until that color disappears. This way I can get a bit of a hue shift that will show up under the coming layers. Now I have a much more detailed base layer to work from. What? A base layer? I know it seems like a lot of work for just a base layer, but what I mean by that is that as I get lighter in color, now I also get lighter on the pigmentation and transparency of the paint. So with just a small brush tip full of my next mid-mix, I move the airbrush backwards again and spray evenly over the top side of them in another airbrush glaze. The next step should look quite a bit familiar as well, as it's the same thing I did when building up from the base coat. Using a transparent mix, I start to build up his highlights in general areas. So the fists, top of the body, that sort of thing. It's not quite the brightest mix yet, but second to brightest, meaning we're almost to the last. Which of course is going to be the pale skin I mixed at first all that time ago, just with a bit more white because it wasn't different enough from my mid-mix. And before I start airbrushing into the details, I want to add some textures around the knuckles, just a few thin lines on each of them. I'll also include the elbows in this. When I do put it into the airbrush, it's still with a bunch of medium to make sure it stays transparent. I don't want to cover all my work, but blend it out. So some light layers in the round parts of the muscles, just like before with the underlayer, carving out that definition, but making sure we can still see the colors underneath. Because I want the fists to stand out and be more blue, which they are still in the shadows, I'm going to apply an airbrush glaze to give them that tint, but use a blue ink, thinned out in a medium, and then just a small brushful of that into the airbrush with even more medium. Ink is pretty strong, so I have to dilute it out a lot so that it's only tinting and not covering. And the last thing for the skin is going to be adding some more color in. I did some blue, but what about where the skin might be more flush? So with some magenta and red, and a very small amount of it going into the airbrush with the mediums again. Then like I did with the blue thin layers, but only at the elbow and knees, and that's it, giving me a bit of a red hue to the blushy areas. After all that work on the skin, you'd think I'm a hardworking painter. But when it comes to filling in all that color around his gums and between his teeth, I couldn't be less bothered to try and work hard on it. So it's just going to get a couple coats of contrast. Something dark red should be good from any line that you have. I've never painted my lips red before, but I have put on chapstick. Somehow though, I don't think that's going to help here. But I do want to give the Grabbler that vibrant red lipstick look. I'm not going to bother touching up the oversprayed areas though, I'm just going to get right into the texturing, starting with an even lighter mix of the white and magenta I started with, following the lines on its lips already. I'll do another layer with some thinner lines and more on the upper half of the lip, with a mix that's lighter than the previous one, almost white but not quite, still just magenta and white though. Now that I've got the texture, I can put on the lipstick. For this I'm going to use some red ink and a bunch of my matte medium. Again, ink is strong, and even though red is semi-transparent, I still don't want to over-pigment this because I want to do it slowly in layers instead. Painting it on the lips like it's a lipstick, letting it dry, and then building up another layer, until I get an even red with all of that texture poking through. For the teeth, I want to make them pearly white. But with that red as a base, that's just going to make that difficult. So first I want to hue shift them to be more of a yellow underneath. So to do that, I'm just going to use some of the yellow browns, starting with a raw umber, then a raw sienna over top of that. Now I can start to glaze up a pure white, but kind of like I did with the airbrush, starting out really dilute with some medium so that it gets frosty with those yellows first. Then apply the denser pigmented layer over top of that, but leaving a gap before it hits the gums, and giving it a bit of a texture so that there's the slightest hint of a bony hue. I'd like to say that the nails were painstaking and time-consuming to do, but if you look at your own nails, they're pretty much just whatever the color under them is. with a bit of white frost to them. So that's what I did. I just gave them a single coat glaze of a pure white and let the colors underneath show through that frosting. This was a very interesting model for me for two reasons. I was able to paint most of it using the airbrush, and while that sounds quick, because of all the colors and layers, it took some dedication to that airbrush. Second was because it was all mostly one surface, I had to come up with ways to give it different colors if for no other reason than to have some different colors. So sometimes that's when you can get really creative. Check out all of our links in the description. Sign up for our newsletter to get the free STL. Visit the Patreon to have a look at the rest of the Monsters of the Multiverse and the Darkwoods models. There's also a link to our My Mini Factory, where you can grab older collections for both wargaming and tabletop RPGs. Subscribe to this channel to get notified every time we release a video, and check out my personal channel, Paintman Journeying, for more painting tips and tricks.